Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching Focal Length, where we get you a briefing on topics from across the world. What are the most critical issues facing global security and the Indo-Pacific region? Should Taiwan go nuclear to deter China? Is the Quad losing its momentum? And what role will the Allies play as China's naval power grows? Joining us now is Colonel Grant Newsham, retired US Marine Colonel and Foreign Affairs commentator. He has decades of experience in the Indo-Pacific region, to include serving as Reserve Head of Intelligence for Marine Forces Pacific. He was the first Marine advisor to the Japan Self-Defense Force and helped create Japan's amphibious force. Let's find out. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Grant Newsham. My first question to you is, tell us about your book, When China Attacks.
Sure, I'll be glad to. It's like the title suggests, it's actually got two meanings. One of them is a future attack from China. The other is actually an attack that's already happened. And that's the meaning that I take. It's what I wrote the book about, is how China has been attacking the United States for well over 3 decades, just on fronts that America doesn't recognize as war. And the book is written really to inform, say, that the general American public. If you think about last year when that spy balloon came over the United States, a lot of people looked up and said, China, what is going on? Well, this book answers a lot of those questions. And as I said, it explains a long-term multi-front attack that the United States has been under for a long time. As I said, we just refuse to recognize it. It's a peculiarly American way of thinking that unless somebody is shooting at you, they couldn't possibly be at war. The Chinese see it very differently, and they've had a very good run of success for a long time.
So, do you think global focus on Indo-Pacific has shifted due to Ukraine and Gaza wars? And is this a good thing?
Well, unfortunately, I think the focus has shifted back to the Middle East. For a little while, it was refocused on the United States, but now I'm afraid that all the attention is going to Gaza, the Red Sea, Ukraine. Once again, the Asia-Pacific is an afterthought, to the United States at least. And there'll be a lot of people who say, oh, no, we can focus on all places at once, but that's just not the reality. There's only so much bandwidth in Washington, and it can only handle so many crises at once, and this administration's got more than a few. And the US military is also stretched. It's having a hard time supplying Ukraine, providing necessary weapons to Gaza, to the Israelis. It's difficult, and the US military has not kept up with the Chinese threat as it has developed over the last 20 years in particular. So the idea that somehow the Asia-Pacific remains the priority theater or is not going to be shortchanged, that's hard to believe. And once again, there's less attention being paid to the Pacific, and the people who like that the most, unfortunately, they live in Beijing.
Should Taiwan be made a nuclear power to deter China?
Should Taiwan? Oh, not yet. That's a question, though, that is going to have to be answered sooner rather than later, is whether countries like Japan, South Korea should have nuclear weapons of their own. I think for now, the so-called American nuclear umbrella is probably considered solid enough that these countries are not going forth or going forward with their nuclear programs. But it's probably not going to be too long before that becomes a very serious discussion. As for Taiwan, they were, of course, on the way to get nuclear weapons decades ago and were stopped. I think the Americans had a big hand on that. I'll bet Taiwan is wishing now that they had nuclear weapons. But I don't see that as something that is really on the cards for the Taiwanese. They're very much, of course, counting on America's implicit promise that we will protect them.
And what is the role of Quad in ensuring free and open Indo-Pacific?
Oh, well, really is the basis of what we're seeing today, and it is a civilizational clash. Certainly a clash between sort of good countries and very unfree, bad countries. And the Americans, the Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians in particular all have an interest in a region, a world, in fact, where laws matter. And these are laws that have been arrived at after some real effort, a lot of heartache, a lot of bloodshed. And we've put in place a system post-World War II that actually has worked pretty well. And now we're being forced to defend this. Chinese have come along, the Russians as well, North Koreans, etc. But mostly it's driven by the Chinese. And they do not have any respect for existing rules. Their argument is, well, we weren't around when they were made, so they don't apply to us, and everything needs to be changed. So that's where we are, and it is definitely really a fight it's already underway. And going back to what I said at the beginning about this, the Chinese attack that has hit us. And it's not just the Americans, but all the free world. These are attacks on the economic front. Financial front. There's a sort of chemical warfare in the United States, which is the fentanyl. It's illegal, this deadly drug that pours in across the southern border. All of it originates in China. Killed 77,000 Americans a year ago. The number's higher now, and yet nobody does anything. It's biological warfare, the COVID virus as well. Cyber warfare, which has been very successful in stealing our economic secrets. Some of our defense secrets as well. The C-17 transport plane, for example, Chinese apparently got the blueprints, the F-35 stealth fighter. They've done very well. So it is very much a multi-front approach, and it relies a lot on proxies. And that means getting American elites to do China's bidding for them. And the PRC has been very successful at that. And I laid this all out in my book. But it's really a sequence of events and different attacks that really apply to every country, every free country that's under Chinese pressure. And I think they will recognize a lot of what we see, of what I describe in the book.
Do you think Quad is losing steam? Last two Quad summits have had to be cancelled.
Oh, I don't know that it's losing steam. Of course, it hasn't picked up steam. Given this recent history, but I think there is still a very important fundamental alignment of interests on the part of all the Quad members, and that hasn't changed. So there may be some variations in fluctuations in how much sort of concrete effort goes into this, how much momentum it seems to have, but I think the basic sort of reasons for the Quad to exist, they still exist very much. And one might say that it actually depends partly on how much pressure the PRC applies. Is it throwing its weight around in the South China Sea, in the Central Pacific, pressuring Taiwan? Is it playing rough on India's northern border? Is it still supporting guerrillas in eastern India? Is it putting more of the PLA Navy into the Indian Ocean? Is it subverting countries in the Indian Ocean, just like it's doing in all of the Pacific Islands? So the point there is that as China applies pressure, it kind of keeps the Quad going and certainly reminds everybody in the Quad why they actually came together in the first place. So that's sort of a perverse way of looking at it. But China is to thank for the Quad in the first place, and I think is to thank for its continued existence. And I don't see the PRC letting up. So I would expect that the Quad it'll continue moving forward, and I think we'll see more from it in the future.
With China rapidly increasing their naval might, is the USA and other Quad nations equipped to rival China?
Well, if we don't wake up really fast, we won't be. I think for now, we've still got a window when we could make life pretty miserable for the People's Liberation Army Navy and the rest of the People's Liberation Army, particularly if it's a fight that were to take place away from China's shores, far away from the mainland. China still doesn't have the capability to project power much beyond, say, 1,000 miles from its borders, but that's still pretty far. But it isn't where it wants to be. It intends to be a global military. But the sheer numbers, if you look at them, they are depressing. And I'll just speak about the United States Navy. We're down to about 292 ships The Chinese have 375 or so, and they're headed up fast. Our Navy is actually shrinking. We're going to be down to 280 before too long, before we pick up it. But this is what comes really of being lazy, but also condescending towards the Chinese. The idea being, well, they could never be our equals. We're the Americans after all. So we've gotten ourselves into this fix. And also it has been worsened by these other attacks that I've mentioned, these so-called non-kinetic, non-shooting attacks. The American dependence on Chinese money, really addiction to it, that we've seen over the last 30 years, where so much of American business shipped its lifeblood over to China and now got itself dependent on cheap Chinese exports. And the idea is, well, if we get China mad by building up our military, it's going to upset this economic relationship. The businesses in the United States have immense influence in Washington, D.C., so they're a restraining force on any administration that tries to stand up to China. The Trump administration was the first one that actually did this with some success, and the Biden administration has a mixed record right now. But in terms of sheer military on military capacity and capability, the Chinese have caught up to us in certain areas and have overtaken us in certain areas, particularly, say, hypersonic weapons. But also numbers matter. And the Chinese Navy is a pretty good Navy. It's getting better even. And they outnumber us, and they don't have to cover the whole globe like the United States does. So we have to put our Navy, our military all over the world. China just has to concentrate itself near its borders. And that gives you a huge advantage in a fight close to your mainland, say if it's Taiwan, for example. But we have an advantage, of course, is we have some good friends and partners. India primary among that, the Japanese as well, the British, the Australians. If you put these resources that the free nations have together, and you can make them into something useful, not just something that gets together for an exercise now and then, but something where they actually are ready to fight. That presents an enemy like China, and I use that word intentionally because China tells everybody that we're their enemy. So if they say that, I'll reciprocate and take them at their word. But if you have the free nations actually get together and combined military forces and economic power, that is something formidable from Beijing's perspective.
Thank you, Grant Newsham, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on this episode of Focal Length. For more international news updates, stay tuned across NewsX World.